For me, as a person that worked in government for 15 years, one of the things that I thought about as I looked around City Hall, and this was in the city of Boston, was what we had to do to reduce barriers so that my people, so that our people can show up and be government. So what does it look like when we go to the grocery store? How do we make City Hall look like that same experience? And that's something that I think participatory budgeting is a part of the long game strategy to achieve just that. And so when we talk about participatory budgeting, I'm talking about a democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend a portion of a public budget. And in that video, you just had an opportunity very quickly to see how that works. One thing that the video didn't talk about is this kind of first dot or icon up here around designing the process and who does that. So no to, and I'm gonna say PB if that's okay, because participatory budgeting is a lot of syllables. So no two PB processes look the same. No two communities look the same. And so the first part of this is actually forming a steering committee that writes the rules that governs the process. In the city of Boston, when I did this, my steering committee was teenagers because the process was centered around youth and youth engagement. 12 to 25-year-olds decided on $1 million of the city's capital budget, and they were smart. And for me, that's not surprising, but I think that's part of the thing that we're up against here. As you saw in the video, we go out and collect hundreds, if not thousands, of ideas on how to spend a pot of public funds. We develop them into proposals, which I think is the part of this that is the most cool. Then folks vote. The projects with the most votes are implemented, and then we see tangible projects implemented in community. For me, the reason why we do this is part of these charts here. In the city of Boston, when we did participatory budgeting, and I lived in Boston for 20 years, so I happen to talk about Boston sometimes, so forgive me. I do live in Oakland now, so bear with me, y'all. I think one of the things that I found was Harvard University did a study on what we called Youth Lead the Change, which was the name of the PB process. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the spillover effect of PB. Because what we saw was that young people reported being more likely to vote in local and national elections, being more likely to step into a government-owned facility, being more likely to volunteer, being more likely to engage with a community-based organization. So yes, we're gonna talk about dollars and cents here, but we're also gonna talk about the bigger picture, because ultimately, what we're talking about is understanding community spending priorities, government spending priorities, where they align, and arming community members with the skills, tools, and resources to be able to navigate and understand this space. Ultimately, what happens is we see some broader political participation. In Vallejo, California, for example, we saw a PB process happen after the city had announced bankruptcy. So when you describe immense distrust in government, that was wildly present in that space. And they were able to open up a public engagement process that allowed folks that weren't allowed to vote in local and national elections to really engage here. 1 in 5 of the participants in Vallejo's PB process were actually ineligible to vote in local and national elections. And I may have another slide here. Oh, this is a really good slide to take a picture of. I brought this slide so that you all could take a picture of it if you want to talk more about participatory budgeting or what that looks like. But my job here as I opened up this panel was to give you one example of what we're talking about when we're centering equity and thinking about budget justice. My other job here is also to introduce some amazing folks, because it's not only PB. There are various strategies to achieve and really center our conversation and our fight for equity in this space. And so the first person I want to introduce is Dan Geiger to share his work with you.
I think Debbie was going to go first because we kind of built on her.
That sounds great. So everybody make some noise for Debbie Lerman.
I think we're on. Yes. Hi, I'm Debbie Lerman. I'm the director of the San Francisco Human Services Network. We're a public policy association of about 70 health and human service nonprofits in San Francisco, and we work on issues that impact our sector and the people that we serve. We advocate in the budget every year. This year we're asking San Francisco for inflation-based increases in nonprofit city contracts and for a pot of money to pay for wages so that we can give raises to our workers who, like the teachers and the bus drivers, also deserve to be able to live in the community where they work. But I'm not here to talk about HSN. I'm here to talk about the San Francisco Budget Justice Coalition, which is a broad-based coalition of nonprofits and of other coalitions, mostly health and human services, but some other issue areas as well, and sometimes with the participation of labor organizations too. It's been around for about 10 years, but it actually grew out of a smaller coalition called the People's Budget that's been around for at least 20 years, largely homeless advocates that would get involved at the tail end of the city budget process and come out with a list of unfunded needs in the community and some suggestions on areas where the city could cut to pay for those needs. As I said, about 10 years ago, the group got together and started to grow and be more broad-based under the basic mission that the city budget, which is our most important policy document every year, should ensure access for everybody to basic needs like housing, food, health, education, jobs, services, etc., and that the city budget should reduce all forms of inequity, whether that's income-based, race and ethnic-based, and various specific population-based needs in the city. Now, 10 years later, the Budget Justice Coalition has about 40 members. We no longer just get together at the end of the budget process. We meet just about year-round. We even pay member dues and have a part-time staff person who's tremendously helpful with taking notes and processing documents and setting meetings. This is what we do. Everybody's got their individual budget asks in various categories: education, childcare, health, HIV/AIDS, housing and homelessness, on and on. And everybody's doing their advocacy around the city with the mayor, with the board of supervisors, trying to secure funding. We get together and develop a collective list of budget asks from our community, which this year totals about $128 million. And we put that together in basically a book with the list on a spreadsheet. This year's is 8 pages long. And narratives for each budget ask, explaining the purpose of it, and we get that to all our policymakers, and we shop that list as a group. It's very important that even though individual organizations are doing their advocacy, when we go out as the Budget Justice Coalition, we advocate for all, and we resist being pitted against each other in the budget process. All our needs are important. And I'm not going to, in 5 minutes, go into the details of the San Francisco budget process, but we go out and set meetings with the mayor's budget office, our supervisors. We turn out for public hearings in droves, and we hold rallies. And typically, at the end of the budget process, we've been able to secure $20 to $30 million towards the needs on those lists, beyond what the mayor allocates in his or her budget. So we have had a tremendous impact. Of course, we are fortunate to have a very progressive city with a progressive board of supervisors, and that has led a lot to our success. Some of our supervisors have been champions for our work. But I also want to say that we've broadened our work over the years. We no longer just advocate around the budget, but we also identify potential revenue sources and, again, comb through the budget looking for potential savings and advocate for things that could be reallocated to the needs that we're suggesting. This year, for the first time, we've done 2 trainings on the city budget process that are designed to empower the community, whether it's nonprofit staff or clients, so that they feel comfortable coming to City Hall and speaking in public comment. And one very exciting development last year, we did a 3-page white paper on budget process reform to increase equity, transparency, and community engagement in the budget process. And we have a supervisor who's very interested in pursuing legislation to implement some of those reforms. And the last thing I want to note is that San Francisco also does a very tiny bit of participatory budgeting. There's some little pots in the budget for each of our 11 supervisorial districts, and 3 of our supervisors have chosen to distribute some of that money through a district-specific PB process where community members who live in the district can propose projects. There's outreach, they vet the projects and develop them further, and then anybody who lives in that district can vote, and that's how they decide who will get funded. So I will pass.
Make some noise for Debbie, y'all. And thank you for that work. And before I introduce Dan, I just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to talk about things that hopefully bring up some common threads. And the reason why I've asked my fellow panelists to be really short in their remarks is so that we can turn some time over to y'all to ask some questions. So get ready for those. After Dan speaks, we'll kind of take stack of a couple questions, and then we'll have a conversation. Dan.
Great, thank you. So I'm Dan Geiger, and when I grow up, I want to be like Sherry and Debbie. So thank you both. So I'm the coordinator for the Contra Costa Budget Justice Coalition. Anybody here from Contra Costa? Okay, hi. So I also have another role that I play in Contra Costa. I'm the director of the Human Services Alliance of Contra Costa. And when I was in that capacity, it was about a year ago, December, like a year and a half ago or so, I and several other people in the Contra Costa area we were always talking about the budget, and none of us understood how it works. We didn't know the process. We didn't really know if there was money available for X, Y, or Z. And I actually had lunch with Debbie one day, and she told me about the Budget Justice Coalition. I was like, wow, that's exactly what we need. And I told some people, and literally within a month we launched, and we went public at a Board of Supervisors meeting. And, we have a website now and all that stuff. I got hired as the coordinator, and it's been very interesting. So that was just a year ago, January. And so what we realized, we did a survey before we officially launched, and we sent it to around 75, between our networks. We just sort of send it out. Within 4 days, we had over 400 responses. We were kind of blown away because it just seemed to strike a chord. And we asked a few questions like, how well do you understand the budget? And it was like 98% no, not at all, and what are your most important issues and so on? What are your priorities? And housing and homeless came up first, not too big a surprise, and several others. So we founded with a vision with really two things. One is to increase understanding of the budget and transparency in the process and engagement in the process. And two was to advocate for priorities that benefit those most in need. So that's really our driving force. And when we started, what we kind of realized is, we don't understand the budget. And so we hired somebody, and who had a lot of experience doing county budgets, and he did a workshop. And he kind of went through, here's how county budgets work in general. And then he talked a bit about Contra Costa in particular. And that was very instructive, actually. There's a lot of strings that county money has, that we didn't really understand that well. And he also did research on models, including some of the kinds of things Sherry's talked about. And that was also very interesting. And we found he used case studies from like 5 or 6 counties around the country. And one that comes to mind was Yolo County, which did like a strategic plan for the county. They articulated like 5 goals over 5 years. And every year, and it was very much a community engaged process. And every year when they would do the budget, they would tie the goals and the dollars in the budget to the strategic plan. And then they would come back and look like, okay, how did that go? What's happening? So every year it was like this really great process. So it was very, very interesting for us. But then we spent the first year focusing a lot on just educating people about the budget. So we did some town halls, we did some more workshops, and we started going around and meeting with the supervisors and the county administrator. And every county is different, right? Contra Costa is very different than San Francisco. We don't have a mayor. We have a board of supervisors, and there's a county administrator who's not an elected position, and he pretty much kind of puts the budget together, and it all happens. And by the time it's rolled out, there's only, X number of people kind of behind closed doors who have done it. And by the time it gets to the public and people are advocating, it's pretty much a done deal. So there's very little wiggle room for influence into the process as the process is being developed. So that was one of our, key focus. And so we developed a proposal to embed kind of community engagement opportunities throughout the process. And, typically like county budgets, they are on a fiscal year starting July, but their first draft might come out in January, February. But it's in the fall when they start thinking about it and, and so on. And there's no opportunity to engage with anybody at that point. And so we put a proposal on the table. We took it to the board. We took it to the county administrator and various department heads. And we've had some success of having some. We had recently had a great kind of public forum with the head of the health services and employment and human services, which are the largest departments in the county. And we had a great conversation with them about their budgeting and how they think about it, what their values are, and so on. And so we're learning a lot about it. And we're also kind of now really advocating and pushing more. So for example, one thing that Contra Costa does on an annual basis, in January, the board has a retreat, and it's kind of a kickoff preview of the budget. And they have an economist come and talk about the macroeconomic situation. And then the county administrator kind of gives a preview of the budget, like here's what we're looking at from the state and this and that. And then that's it. And then it's, then I was like, okay, great, thank you. And this past January, my interpretation of the presentations were macroeconomics, water everywhere, county administrator, not a drop to drink. And it was kind of like, and there was no discussion of, well, what's happening in the community? Where are the service gaps? Who's hurting? How can we address that? And so we have been asking for, hey, can there be an explicit inclusion of an analysis and presentation of the needs of the community and the service gaps in the whole, not just the retreat, but throughout. And just this past Tuesday, actually, the chair of the board added an amendment to the approval of the budget that they start doing that and are forming a work group to do that. So that just happened Tuesday, and we were like, actually, I made the public comments at the meeting, and I wasn't expecting him to do that. I was like, right on, John, that was great. So it's progress, but Contra Costa is really, really different than San Francisco or Alameda or a lot of other counties. It's more conservative. It's very dispersed. Power is not central. We don't have a mayor who can walk in and say, here, do this. It's just really, really different situation, and it's different politically. Lastly, just real quick point. The end point of almost all of our conversations and discussions, it is a reality that counties don't have a lot of flexibility about money because so much of it comes from the state and the feds. And that's true. And I know that, I understand that a lot better now than I did before. And where our conversations almost always lead to is we need more revenue. So now the same chair of the board started talking about revenue generation. How can we, can we put a tax measure on the ballot and so on to generate more revenue for the things we need? So we're finding that inevitably these conversations lead to how do we get more revenue. So now I think we have an opportunity actually to kind of build a broader coalition with labor, with groups like ours. We have about 25 members, and a lot of them are coalitions, advocacy, racial justice coalition, and so on. And time is up, so I'm going to stop.
Well, your time's not up. We're just going to reformat how we use some of this time. And I think one theme that I'm hearing as the three of us have kicked off this conversation around budget justice and equity is three words are coming to mind for me: visibility, transparency, and accountability. And I think in all of our work, these are center points of how we kind of move this work ahead. I promised that I was going to allow some time for you all to ask questions, and I want to honor that. We have a whopping 15 minutes. And so I think if we do this well, I might be able to take 3 rounds of questions, but I have one favor to ask. Sometimes when I do this, folks try and ask 3 questions at once, just so that we can practice a little bit of equity in this room. Can you please ask 1 question, and we'll take 3 at a time, and then we'll share in responding to those, if that's okay. Do we have anyone that wants to ask a question? We'll start here, and then we'll go here. Great. And then I have a question over here.
Yeah, to that accountability point, your first presentation, I was wondering about when you do the PD stuff, how do you actually compel or ensure that the government agency actually follows through with complying with the code?
And we'll talk about accountability. I'll let you all think about your next wave of questions. And Dan, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah, so the revenue question is very interesting. And I mean, usually counties, they can generate revenue through things like sales tax, parcel tax, utility tax, and there's a couple other things. And so Santa Clara just did a half a percent sales tax for a transportation measure, for example, that passed, I believe, last year. And in Contra Costa, we're just in initial conversations, and a lot of it's about like, well, number one, what are we going to use it for? And number two, how do we frame this? So, the supervisor was talking about, well, children and families is always a good way to talk about things, but we'll probably need to build a coalition with different types of interests and funding things to kind of build the coalition needed to win. It's really, really hard. You need 67%. It's insane in California, right? It's like really, really hard. And Contra Costa has not been successful doing that in the past. It's hard to get people to come out and vote in favor of it. So it is an uphill battle, but our thing is like, well, it may be an uphill battle, but let's start taking leadership to push in that direction and educate people about why this is necessary.
So when it comes to accountability, I'm really curious to hear some of Debbie's thoughts on this. I'll start if you want to finish off. But when it comes to PB, there are two really important things that have to happen. The first thing, and I mentioned this, is at the very beginning, a steering committee comes together that writes the rules that governs the process. So that's how we ensure transparency on the front end. And that's not just for how we outreach, but the duration of the process. And that's wildly important. The second thing that happens, I mentioned my most favorite phase of participatory budgeting is proposal development. This is where community members and those that work in government, agency staff, kind of sit down together and put price tags on things. And they think about need, feasibility, and impact. So nothing makes it onto the ballot unless it can really happen if it receives the most votes. And that there's a deeper learning process and important facilitation elements that are key and crucial here. But I would say that these are paramount steps in ensuring accountability in a PB process. And I'm curious, Debbie, to hear if you have other thoughts.
Well, my thoughts on that are from the budgeting perspective, not specifically PB, but what we go through in San Francisco every year is the mayor will submit her budget to the board on June 1st, and the board will review it in June, and at the end of the month, the board will have found some pots of money and will have added a bunch of things back into the budget. As I said, it could be anywhere from $15 to $40 million worth of programs and services, many of them from our ask list. And what happens next is the mayor has the power of the purse. That lies with the executive branch. And it is an accountability issue, and it is a big problem that if the mayor really doesn't want to implement something, it's probably not going to happen. Even if the money's been allocated by the board, they can delay. Our contracting processes are very long, so money gets set aside for something and it's March and no contract's been signed. So it is a big problem, and it is part of the stated mission of the budget justice process to continue our advocacy and work together to fight to see that those programs are implemented. But sometimes we don't get that, unfortunately. It is hard to hold government accountable. So I wish I had a better answer than that, other than we keep fighting and we try to make it visible.
I am going to ask a question about what it feels like when we're fighting this uphill battle and it gets really tough. And I'm gonna save that for just a moment. I wanted to see if we had another round of questions. We have here and here. Yes. Thank you very much. So for those that don't know, I was named a 2019 Obama Fellow a couple weeks ago. I just got back from DC, and yes, I met Michelle Obama, and that's a longer conversation outside of this room. But what is your question? Definitely. A second question? Yeah, so I'm gonna try and respond to these questions at the same time. So this first question about what happens when we're in a space and we're having a hard time getting folks to see the bigger picture around equity, and what can we do to really push the needle there? And we're seeing the same sort of decisions made that we feel are not reflective of what is needed in community. Well, there are a couple things, and the first thing that I would say that I see, and having done this work for a long time inside of government and on the other side of government, is how important coalition building is. And I think we were talking about this in the car ride over here. So often, especially in this space, we find that we're doing very similar work in a wildly siloed fashion. And we talk about how important it is to come together to fight for similar things and have a shared agenda. When we're not sharing our voice and building coalitions, it actually has a divisive effect that I've noticed, which can be really challenging in advocacy. The other thing that I'll say quickly is I think we get really frustrated, and rightfully so, when we're trying to communicate a message and we're making that argument and we get a no or we don't get the right response. And something that someone, I won't mention who, said to me recently was that it is our responsibility to keep making the argument, and to be authentic about what that is. I think there are times where, in speaking the language of government, and I am a person that is very fluent in the language of government, we have to decide, we have to make some decisions about risk of what we say and how we say it. And I think it is our responsibility to get really clean on that argument, like this white paper that Debbie has that she mentioned previously, this white paper that we have that we use as a major advocacy tool to convince those in power what the benefits of this are. We really have to center that argument sometimes around them. And those are two different arguments. There's one argument for those that are in government, and they feel a lot of vulnerability when we start talking about open government and public participation. And there's a different conversation that happens with advocates. And I think it's really understanding that space. And I'll just say this, at the end of the day, you have to pay the bills, and so you have to be able to assess the risk in doing that. Ultimately, my biggest learning from this past weekend is you have to be ready to vacate the seat. You have to be willing to fight enough and balance that enough and understand that there's someone coming behind you to move that seat forward. And I think those are really important things in that broader conversation. This technical question about, remind me, I know it was a technical question. So one thing I'll say about participatory budgeting, and this is generally true when we're talking about budget justice in general, is typically when we're trying to find a space in the budget, we're not developing a new line item for community participation. We're identifying a space in the budget where we can make some decisions together. And that is wildly important to understand, first of all. I think generally in my advocacy, and you guys can share what your experience is here, we do talk about finding that space in the budget together before we release and launch the process. That's an important piece of transparency and accountability. This is not pretend. This is not a drill. This is real civic engagement and action civics in a way that centers equity. And so we have to be able to identify that on the front end. And then the question that folks in government and institutions ask me all the time is, when do I involve community? And my first response is, well, if you're asking, you've probably waited too long, and that's okay. We're gonna start doing that today. And I don't know if you all have other thoughts you wanna add.
I actually wanted to speak back to the question about the police question in the budget. As the Budget Justice Coalition in San Francisco, when we talk about going after places where we can save money, we have repeatedly gone after the police department, which is overfunded. We have fought with very little success so far against additional police academy classes, and even trying to figure out how much money they spend on ammo at the practice range. But we have a much more progressive board of supervisors in place now, and we're hopeful that we may be able to get some inroads. We have a coalition working against a new jail in San Francisco. We have a very recent effort to close juvenile hall in San Francisco, and our focus in our advocacy is around the alternative of prevention efforts rather than getting to the point where we need police, and on community-based alternatives that keep people out of jail or keep people in non-institutional settings where the outcomes are much likely to be positive. So that is a focus, and I would encourage you to do your homework, get your data together, and highlight those alternatives.
So, Debbie, I'm going to give you the last word on our panel here, so just get ready for that to close us out. And Dan, I'm going to give you the first of 3 last words. And the question I'll ask is, as we close out, where are we going next, or what advice do you have for this room?
3 words.
You can have an entire 30 seconds if you choose.
I guess so it's really interesting hearing from Sherry and Debbie, because they're at a much more mature stage of development than we are. We're just getting started. So in our case, it's like first getting ourselves together, and it was bringing together, human service, community advocacy, racial justice coalition, a whole bunch of different groups that had never happened before. So that becomes a powerful block. And then just starting to look at the question, find out how your budget works. I mean, how many people here knows how the budget works wherever you live? One, so us and one more. So there's your place to start, and it's really, really important. You can't really speak to the issue unless you know what you're talking about, right? And then I think the principles that have been articulated here about how to build that civic engagement are really critical. And I mean, you put those 2 things together, and I think you have the formula.
And before Debbie closes us out, I'll just sneak in a word or 2. I'll just say we need to talk to each other more. And I left my contact information up on the screen for a reason. I want you to use it. I don't want you to reinvent the wheel, but I want you to make the wheel better. And I think the way that we do that is by talking to each other. And I think the last thing that I'll say is, as we're trying to solve really complex problems, I know you all don't need to hear me say this, but the folks that are closest to the issue are likely going to have the best solutions. And so as much as we can work together to empower those voices, I think the better off we're going to be.
I think I want to echo the refrain of talking to each other. Contra Costa started their Budget Justice Coalition because Dan and I had lunch.
Yeah, seriously, that's how it started.
And I see what we're doing as models, and even like pilots that can be spread much, much further around the Bay Area, around the state, around the country. I hope that people will start to notice the work we're doing here. I also, I don't have my contact information on the screen, but I'm happy to share it with anybody, or you can look at our website, sfhsn.org, and feel free to contact me. And I always love to talk about this kind of work that we're doing, and I'm happy to share more about the ideas or share our white paper on the budget process. I am inspired every day by the people that I work with, by the people that we serve, and by all of the colleagues who are doing similar work. And I really appreciate Dan and Sherry for their great efforts. And I'm sure all of you in this room are doing equally inspiring work. So I'd love to hear more about what you're doing. If you have other ideas, we're always open to hearing them too from you.
My name is Ann Stuhldreher. I am not an Obama Fellow. I am not a recovering government person like Sherry. I'm still in government. I lead something called the Financial Justice Project for the City and County of San Francisco. And to my right is Brandon Green, who leads the Civic Innovation Lab for the City of Oakland. And next to him is Lewis Brown Jr., who is with PolicyLink. And we realized, we were just talking back there, that we're what stands between you and the weekend, and you and a Golden State Warriors victory over the Houston Rockets later this evening, that I know we're all excited about. But we're here to talk about something that you may not know about, the fact that right now across California, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are faced with a harrowing choice. They are making a decision between, do I pay this bill for this long list of fees that I was charged for my time in jail and the criminal justice system, or do I use what little money I have to pay for food, rent, and to support my family? What we're here to talk about today is there's tremendous momentum at the local level across our state to get rid of these onerous fees. We're going to talk about work in San Francisco, in Alameda County, and a really exciting bill that the Families Over Fees Act that is moving forward at the state level and needs your help today. So stay tuned for that. I guess I'll start us out just talking about San Francisco. Let me see if I can figure this out. Nothing's happening. There we go. So the Financial Justice Project, we're in the Treasurer's Office, and we believe we're the first effort embedded in government in the country to assess and reform fines, fees, tickets, financial penalties that we found were really bearing down on lower income people and people of color, and weren't really working that well for what we were trying to achieve in government or the courts either. Whoops, it's been about, oh my gosh, this thing is really sensitive. It's been about 2 years since we started, and we have either eliminated or reduced dozens of fines and fees. We have gotten rid of tens of millions of dollars in debt that is hanging over tens of thousands of people. We've worked in a lot of different policy areas. Unfortunately, it's a kind of a target-rich environment. But today we're going to talk about these high-paying, low-gain criminal justice fees. So what you're seeing up there now is a bill that someone brought into our public defender's office. And don't worry if you can't read what's on there, because it wouldn't, frankly, make that much sense, even if you could. Though most people, when they exit jail or the criminal justice system, are handed a bill like this. This is a long list of fines and fees. For this person, it added up to $5,000. Some of the ones we charge in San Francisco are $50 a month to pay for probation, but in San Francisco, we were charging $1,800 to someone up front because people are typically on probation for 3 years, charges for things like pre-sentence reports, drug tests, $35 a day to rent your electronic ankle monitor. So, as we started to learn about this, and there was a lot of work going on in Alameda County at the time as well, we decided to come together, both with people within government and a broad community coalition that was really pushing for these changes. Oops. And what we learned is that these fees are high paying, right? They're charged to very low income people. Most people, when they exit jail or the criminal justice system, they don't have jobs, their housing is unstable, it's very hard to get a job. In San Francisco, we found that 21,000 people owed about $32 million in debt from these fees. And you can see some more information on that up here. Again, we also found that these fees created huge barriers to people's reentry. I mean, people really need what little money they have to get by, not to send a check in payments kind of to the government each month. We also found that these fees are low gain, meaning that they're a really terrible and unjust source of revenue. The collection rate on the largest probation fee, or the largest fee, the monthly probation fee, was just 9%. There's something wrong when a collection rate on a fee is 9%. And you can see, again, the difference between the amount of money that was assessed and the amount of money that was coming in. So we eliminated, and that's Treasurer Cisneros, who's in charge of revenue for the city and county, who I report to, and next to him is Mayor London Breed. We became the first county in the nation to eliminate all of these local fees that are charged to people and lifted off, as I mentioned earlier, $32 million in debt from these fees that was owed by 21,000 people. This work is not just happening in San Francisco. There's been work in Alameda County. There's work in LA, in Contra Costa County. And there's a really exciting coalition that's pushing statewide reform that we're also going to hear about. And these are some, we like to write reports at the Financial Justice Project. So these are a bunch of our reports. But I think now I'm going to turn it over to Brandon.
So my name is Brandon Green, with the E on the end, which is not on here. Currently, I manage the Civic Design Lab in the city of Oakland, which is a public-private partnership. But prior to that, I created and ran a clinic at the East Bay Community Law Center focused on decriminalization of poverty. We had a direct services clinic every Wednesday, an in-court clinic every last Friday of the month. Though we were the largest clinic of Berkeley Law School and were really focused on direct services, I took a different model with my clinic, which was a movement lawyering model. And what that meant was we were always trying to put ourselves out of business. So the things that we'd see our clients experiencing, we would then take those experiences, those issues with the system, and create policy. So we were part of the Back on the Road Coalition, which is the coalition that got rid of driver's license suspensions for failure to pay in California. I wrote the bill AB 503, which makes it so that every city has to have an ability to pay process for parking tickets for indigent folks prior to attempting to withhold their vehicle registration. And we also got rid of probation, supervision, public defender representation, and sheriff's work alternative program fees in Alameda County. Though it's not a competition, I always like to say we started the work before San Francisco, but San Francisco finished it before us, and has gone on to be able to continue doing a lot of work through Ann's office, which, to the question earlier about interfacing with government, right? The fact that San Francisco has a financial justice project that is embedded in the treasurer's office, and San Francisco is both a city and a county, makes it a little bit easier to maneuver some of the government bureaucracy. It actually took us a little under 3 years to do this. So my first day at EBCLC, I got handed a stack of case files from the former director of my team, who actually left like days after I started, and was told to figure this thing out. So through a series of Public Records Act requests and other things, we were able to gather a lot of information. And really, some of that information, I believe, had the probation department believing that we were going to sue them because they weren't doing the things that they're supposed to be doing around ability to pay processes. We had one client who was on probation in San Mateo, had got an ability to pay process and had his fines and fees reduced, and then had his probation transferred to Alameda County, where he's actually charged more money. We discovered this, and they said there was an accounting error. That accounting error led to conversations where all of a sudden the city attorney was showing up, or the county attorney was showing up, and we were able to move things a little bit faster because we got the probation chief on board. So when we got rid of these fees, it was actually around $45 million worth of fines and fees in Alameda County. Now everybody can participate in the Sheriff's Work Alternative Program, which, for those who are unfamiliar, is an alternative to jail. But you have to pay up front. So if you can't afford to pay, then you go to jail. Obviously, these things have very, very severe racial disparities. So in Alameda County, the vast majority of people, or the people who are going to disproportionately benefit from this, are Black folks because of the way policing happens in the city of Oakland. And so while all this was happening, EBCLC, the ACLU, and Lawyers Committee in San Francisco started a coalition, which Lewis will talk about in a second, which was really a spinoff of the Back on the Road Coalition, and it's called Debt Free Justice California, because some of the folks in the Back on the Road Coalition wanted to solely focus on traffic, while the rest of us were focusing on a wide array of fees. And so now we have this broad coalition, which leadership structure includes policy folks, community-based organizations, et cetera. And I will let Lewis talk a little bit about the coalition, the bill, and then we'll have an ask of you all, and you can ask us some questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Louis Brown Jr. I'm from PolicyLink, as Ann said. So I'll just say a little bit about PolicyLink, make a few points about criminal fees in general, talk about the coalition, and then about the bill that we've referenced several times here. So PolicyLink, for you, those of you who don't know, I know my colleague presented this morning, so I may be repeating some of this, but I wasn't at the plenary, so I don't know what she said. So PolicyLink is a national organization focused on achieving racial and economic equity for low-income communities and communities of color. We're based in Oakland. We work at federal, state, and local levels. Being in California, based in California, we have a significant focus here on our home state, and I focus on state-level advocacy. So PolicyLink, up until a couple of years ago, maybe several years ago, in terms of its economic equity work, focused a lot on how to get money into people's pockets, right? So how to make sure that we have that low-income people of color have fair access to jobs, how to make sure low-income people of color have the ability to build assets. What we realize, though, is that if you're not also making sure that people can keep money in their pockets, you're sort of filling a bucket with the hole in the bottom, right? And so we started looking at different wealth stripping policies that undermine people's ability to become financially secure. And at the top of that list for us is criminal fines and fees. And so just for those of you who aren't familiar with the distinction between fines and fees, some people aren't, they're often confused. Criminal fines are meant to punish, right? So you get convicted of a crime, you could be fined, you could be incarcerated. So fines are meant to punish. Criminal fees aren't meant to punish. They're charged on top of whatever punishment you receive. The sole purpose of the fees is to raise money for the government. So they're essentially a regressive tax, right? One of the most regressive taxes, given that 80 to 90% of people in the criminal justice system are poor, they're disproportionately Black and Latino. And so it actually makes sense. I was wondering why we paired this discussion with the budget discussion, but it makes sense that we did, right? Because essentially what these fees are about is governments trying, but often failing, to balance their budgets on the backs of poor people and people of color. And so one other point, I think, obviously, we're talking about government budgets, but we're also talking about family budgets. So I think Ann alluded to it, but these fees impact not just the people who are charged with them, but the people who live in the household with them, people who support them, right? So one study found by the Ella Baker Center found that they did a survey of formerly incarcerated folks and found that over 60%, in over 60% of those cases, families were helping those folks to pay for their fees. And of those who got help from their families, 80% of the primary providers of assistance were women, right? So these fees are impacting families, they're impacting women, they have multi-generational impacts on people, right? And in their families and their communities. So just in terms of the coalition, as Brandon mentioned, the Coalition Debt-Free Justice California was established by the East Bay Community Law Center, really led by Brandon and his colleague Teresa Zinn, and the ACLU, NorCal, right? NorCal. And so the coalition is a statewide network of legal services organizations, grassroots organizations representing impacted folks, impacted people themselves, policy advocates and researchers who are committed to addressing the ways in which our criminal legal system punishes poor folks, criminalizes them, undermines their ability to thrive. And so the coalition has been in existence for about 2 years. We officially launched last November. And this year we're focused on criminal fees. So we've worked together with Senator Holly Mitchell, who is a senator from LA, is also the budget chair in the Senate, chair of the Senate Budget Committee, to introduce the Families Over Fees Act, which is also known as SB 144. So this bill actually builds on the work that San Francisco and Alameda County did, taking their repeal as a model, their repeal in the waiver of as a model for what we should do across the state. So the bill does a couple of things. So one, it eliminates all criminal administrative fees. And so that includes all the fees that San Francisco eliminated, as well as Alameda County, probation fees, public defender fees, probation supervision fees, et cetera. And it also significantly, importantly, discharges the outstanding debt that was incurred because of those fees. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of relief for low-income families and families of color. And so in terms of where we are with the bill passed out of the Senate Public Safety Committee. It's now being heard or pending before the Senate Appropriations Committee. We're at a critical juncture with the bill. And I think after the Q&A, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can be helpful. Let's do it now. We're doing it now. Okay. All right. So before we do that, how many of you, are there any of you who don't have this SB 144 support document? Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm. So if you don't pay your fees, your credit can be impacted, your wages can be garnished, your driver's license can be suspended, your tax refund. So a lot of people in here work on the state earned income tax credit. The population that would receive that credit, so the population that are having these fees imposed on them are the same population that would be eligible to receive the credit where they're working. And so if you were someone with fees and you didn't pay, and you were eligible to receive an earned income tax credit, the FTB, the Franchise Tax Board, could take it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mean how can we repair their credit reports and stuff like that? Do you all have a?
The question is, the answer is there's really not an answer to that question. So Alameda County is supposed to be, the probation chief was interested in doing some level of like credit repair-esque workshops, but what that is actually going to look like is uncertain. It's not always true that these things end up on credit reports, but it is always true that if you are unable to pay, that you are referred to a collection agency. Usually they're one of three of the top three, biggest collection agencies in California, like Alliance One, which is in Contra Costa County, Alameda County, et cetera. And it goes to the Franchise Tax Board. And also, it's a little bit too soon to tell, because the Franchise Tax Board and the transfer between a county to a collections agency, back to a county to report that the debt is outstanding, back to the Franchise Tax Board, a lot of things get messed up. Before I left, we were trying to think about ways to sue the Franchise Tax Board because of those issues. So it's a little bit too soon to tell, but the immediate impact on folks is that they are no longer getting those bills and are able to, at least in a very small way, try to go about their lives.
So as I mentioned, the bill is at a critical junction, the Senate Appropriations Committee, and we are trying to make sure we let the Senate leadership know how important this bill is and how critical it is to get it out of committee. And so what you have before you or in your hands or on your chair is there's a call script that a call script and some sample tweets. So what we're trying to do is reach out to Senator Toni Atkins, who's the Senate Pro Tem, or the President of the Senate, and urge her to help us get the bill out of the Senate Appropriations Committee. So the call script that you have before you provides her phone number, the phone number to her office. You can use that script if you'd like. We'd actually encourage you to use that script to call her office to encourage her to help us get the bill out of committee and to the floor. The other thing that you can do in addition to that or in lieu of that, if you're on Twitter, you can use the sample tweets which are on the back of that sheet of paper and tweet to Senator Atkins urging her to support SB 144. We could do that now as well. How many of you are on Twitter? All right. So I don't want to pressure anybody, but if you are so inclined, if you could whip out the Twitter app, and you can actually just tweet it out. I just tweeted out a tweet. My Twitter handle is @Lou Brown Jr. LEWBROWNJR. You can just retweet the tweet that I just tweeted out, or you can take some time and tweet out your own tweet. So is that the way you say it? Like tweet out your tweet? Like I don't know. It sounds weird, right? Like, but I don't know. I was born in '81, so I'm not fully sort of adjusted to.
I was born in '82, and I don't sound like that when I talk about technology. You can also go. If you go to CA Debt Justice on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, you can also just retweet the messages from there.
Retweet, yeah. Okay. I think we're getting far afield. So please tweet out a note to Senator Atkins urging her to support the bill. Feel free to retweet my tweet. I think that's okay. @Lou Brown Jr. or go to @CA Debt Justice. All right.
Yeah, fair fines and fees have
right.
started.
Yeah.
There's many options to retweet.
Right.
Yeah, maybe we should take some questions now.
Yeah.
Just really quick, because I didn't say this, which I should have. So the Civic Design Lab in Oakland, I mentioned that it's a private-public partnership. It's under the Office of Resiliency. My new job is to build that from the ground up, re-envisioning it, and essentially what it is taking on projects using design thinking as one framework, but really with the racial equity focus to change the systems in the city of Oakland. The city of Oakland is a little bit different than other places because there's a Department of Race and Equity. There's an ordinance that sort of governs that. And so I'm really trying to take the work that I did at East Bay Community Law Center and really try to change the way in which these systems in the city of Oakland impact folks and change the lived experiences of folks. I feel like I had to say that since it's my new job.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
All right. Questions?
Yeah, questions? Yeah, in the back. Definitely. Do you want to start? Any of us
Sure.
can speak to that.
So I mean, this is just me. Like I think a lot of these distinctions don't really matter. So there's not really a distinction between transportation fees and criminal fines and fees on the whole, because if you get, for instance, 5 parking tickets that you can't pay, they're gonna tow your car. Before we wrote AB 503, if you couldn't pay your parking ticket, they would withhold your vehicle registration. If you got pulled over by a cop because you didn't have registration, which is an infraction, then your car would be towed. And traffic court is actually a derivative of criminal court. So everything that we think of traffic tickets are actually criminal infractions instead of misdemeanors or felonies. And the same population of folks are impacted. So whether we're talking about on the whole fees for BART, and who are the folks who hop the gate to take BART and are criminalized for that, right? As a general matter, one, those things can either be an infraction or a misdemeanor. And two, it's usually the same population of folks. Similar to towing, the Lawyers Committee, EBCLC, and some other folks put out a report on towing. And if you look at the numbers, again, disproportionately, the folks whose vehicles are being towed are going to be low-income folks of color. In Oakland, it's going to be disproportionate impact in East Oakland rather than like the hills, for instance. And I just say that because I think a lot of times we end up talking about things like, for instance, using the frame financial justice instead of racial justice. But really, for instance, if you look at the Oakland Equity Report, every single thing that you can imagine in the city of Oakland disproportionately impacts Black people. Like everything from police use of force to attrition rates in the police academy, right? Like every single metric. So everything generally that is touching financial justice is usually actually a racial justice issue, whether we're talking about transportation, criminal justice stuff, library fines and fees. Like these generally almost always have a racial impact. If you want to speak more.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly. I mean, that was a huge issue when we started, and still is in San Francisco. In San Francisco, if your car gets towed, it's about $575. 10% of cars when we started were people couldn't retrieve them. And imagine losing your car. For a lot of people, it's their biggest asset. We were able to cut towing rates about in half for people below 200% of the poverty line. We were able to cut boot fees by 80% for people below 200% of poverty. And building off this AB 503, a statewide bill, we also heard a lot about parking tickets. Very expensive in San Francisco. They were doubling through late fees. We're fortunate we were able to go further than the statewide legislation. We eliminated previously there were some remedies in San Francisco, but they didn't work for people. There was a payment plan, but you had to pay $65 to get onto the payment plan. You could perform community service to get rid of your parking tickets, but it was between $75 and $150 to perform community service. So we got rid of a lot of those fees and the late fees, kind of building off some of this statewide legislation. And the number of people who used payment plans went up 400% in San Francisco. And interestingly, the revenue went up for SFMTA as well over that first 3-month period in comparison to the 3 months the year before. There's a lot of research that shows that if you make, some of these things more reasonable for people to pay, they will pay. And again, there's a very big difference, I think, between fines and fees. A lot of the fees, and some fines too, but the fees in the criminal justice system, these are folks who've already paid lots of consequences. And these fees are not meant to be punitive, but they are. And their only job is to recoup costs, and they don't do that. And it's really time to get rid of them. Yeah.
Two questions, one at a time if somebody else has questions also. But the first one was, and we've talked a little bit about efforts to eliminate the fines and fees or reduce reduce them at city levels, at county levels. We now have the state level one. What kind of activities happening in terms of coordinating those efforts or determining is it more effective to operate at a city level versus a county level versus a state level? Because I know that's been a conversation around like rent control ordinances and other kinds of taxes.
Does anybody want to? I can start. It's a great question, and it's really, I think, a mess. And there's certain fines and fees at the city level, at the county level, at the state level, at the court level. And a lot of times when you start talking to people about them, even internal to government, people are like, oh, we can't get rid of that. Like, that's required at the state level. It's a mess in a lot of ways. And I think that, there's efforts, fortunately, in California that are brewing kind of at the city level. San Francisco is both a city and a county. And LA at the county level, Contra Costa County. We get calls, Brandon, Lewis get calls. We get people from all over the state and all over the country that want to take this on. I think that, it's, I'm excited about this bill. I hope we can get it, done and eliminate them across the state. But I think like a lot of policy reform, if you can make it happen at the local level, it builds momentum for reforms at the state level. I don't know what you guys would say.
I would just say it's an equity issue. So the coordination happens through coalition work, but in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to think that there's going to be 50 some odd local campaigns that happen that generate the impact of the county campaigns. The county campaigns, in my opinion, necessarily have to bubble up to a statewide campaign because the state has the power to make the counties do this thing. Just like if we were talking about desegregation, right? Like relying on local control and local governments to do that thing. I mean, history has just shown that doesn't work. On the the point I made about like the distinction, in my opinion, being artificial, right? We know that as a general matter that like black folks and white folks commit crimes at about the same rate, but black folks are disproportionately incarcerated. So in my opinion, like the idea, one, like it's also true that the punitive fines have gone up, and the reason they've gone up is because they're still a revenue generation source and they're made to punish. The question is, who are they made to punish, since we know who's disproportionately being impacted? And so I think it depends. Like obviously like library fees it makes sense for that to bubble up at a city or county level. But if we know that it's disproportionately impacting the same or similarly situated folks everywhere, then like a statewide bill always makes the most sense. Just like in the juvenile fines and fees space, it started in Contra Costa County and Alameda County and San Francisco, but it took a statewide bill to make it happen in the state. And then it even took implementation that's still occurring right now to like try to get the dismissal of the fees.
So just two things. One, so I agree with you. The one, I would state your point slightly differently. I would say that the low collection rate makes it worse. It's not what makes it bad in the first place, right? So even if they were collecting 100% of the fees, the fact that they are charging fees to low-income people who can't make ends meet.
Well, I feel like they know they're not going to get it. They're
Right.
anyways, just
Right.
punish.
No. I'm not disagreeing. No. I'm just building on your point. I'm not disagreeing with you. I agree 100%. But I think there's just a larger point about how do we fund our government, right? How do we fund the criminal justice system? Do we use general fund tax revenue, regular tax revenue, or do we place that burden on people who can least afford it? The other point I wanted to make was about some of the reaction that we've gotten from counties, which is sort of related to this issue that we're just talking about. The response that we get, the pushback that we get is that, well, if you eliminate these fees, then some services are going to suffer, or probation is going to lose revenue, or the counties are going to lose revenue, right? And our point is that, one, as Ann said and as you said, you're not collecting that much in the first place. We don't know what you're netting because we can't even assess what your true costs are because they're not keeping records or not keeping records rigorously. And two, you shouldn't be funding your government, your services on the backs of poor people. Let's rethink how we're budgeting, right? And one other point, so criminal fees have been around for a long time, but they went up once the recession hit and tax revenue dropped, right? So it's just another point to underscore the fact of what the purpose of the fees are. Did you guys?
No. Yeah. Follow with us all after, or no, because I have to catch a train. But you can email me or find me on the Twitter, as Lewis said.
Thank you so much.